My grandfather died and his will demands that I kill my father. He left several things for the family. My father received his collection of watches, my mother received a few books he felt she would like, mostly historical diaries, and I was bequeathed a letter, a small wooden box, and his cane. In his will, my grandfather insisted that I read the letter alone, and that neither the cane nor the box be placed in the hands of anyone but myself. I've read the letter, opened the box, and studied the cane. I'll retype the letter, leaving out a few personal details, but all the important information is there. It reads: Dear beloved grandson, you have not yet been born. In fact, your father has only just come into this world, and it saddens me deeply to put down these words, but I must. Your father, though I already love him more than anything in the world, must be ended before nature or accident claims him, after I have died. The task will fall on you, his firstborn child, and you may not seek anyone's assistance in this matter. When I die, this letter, my cane, and the vial will be transferred to your possession. The cane's handle may be detached, and the interior has been hollowed out and fitted with a small firing mechanism. The vial is to be inserted into the cane, the handle returned unsealed. When twisted counterclockwise, a blade will extend from the tip of the cane. This blade, after the vial has been inserted, will be enhanced with a potent poison. You are to stab your father in the heart with the cane, or, when the jewel embedded in the handle is clicked, to fire the blade, which simultaneously acts as a dart. If your mother interferes, do whatever you can to convince her to relent, and if not, the cane works doubly as a fine blunt weapon. I know you must love them dearly, but by reading this letter you have been charged with an irrefusable duty. You must accomplish this task within the week that follows my demise, no matter the circumstances. Your father does not know it, but he is not human, and neither was his mother, your grandmother. I have done many questionable things in my life, and perhaps the most heinous is my betrothal to that extraterrestrial succubus. I was a fool, acted on urges, rather than sense. But the past is the past, and I have slain her. I told your father that she died in her sleep, and that she did, but it was only by implementation of the same poison which you now must utilize against someone you love. When I die, a certain charm, or enchantment shall be lifted from your father, a charm I placed upon him as a child, so that he would not know what he truly was, would not grow into the fate portended by his genealogy. Your grandmother, though kind in her own, inhuman way, wanted your father to become a leader amongst men, to usher us into a new state of civilization, but I have seen the efforts of her race as men, in the historical tomes she has shown to me. They are a progressive, intelligent race, for sure, but they achieve this progress by any means necessary. Genocide, apathy bordering on cruelty, these are commonplace among their people. Thankfully, fortunately, your grandmother was an outcast, a self-exiled female of their kind, who came here in search of a more peaceful race. While I don't believe she found exactly what she had sought, I am grateful for her aberrant desire which brought her here. I loved her, from the moment I found her curled up in that crater, during my league's expedition to the Arctic. She learned our language, culture, and mannerisms impeccably fast, and I soon graduated from her proctor to her lover. We kept her origins a secret, and thankfully her race differed little in appearance from our own, and what was noticeable was easily concealed by makeup and the appropriate clothing. But as she grew older, she wished a fate for your father that I could not oblige, so I murdered her, using a concoction I learned about from the vast boon of knowledge she had shared with me. I want your father to live a long, healthy life, to experience humanity, he deserves that much. But only as long as I may oversee that life. Within a week after my death, the enchantment over your father's mind will have been dispelled completely, and the predilections, aspirations, and power of his ancestors will fill his mind and heart. I believe he will go on to do brutal, callous things, and thus I cannot, through your hands, allow him to live. I'm sure by now you're wondering if you have inherited the things of him that I fear, and to that I cannot say. But there is enough poison in that vial to slay several of his kind, and I can only hope that if you feel yourself compelled towards disagreeable actions, you will have the virtue and courage to turn the cane on yourself. But I am an old man, and my hopes will most likely mean little to someone of your generation. I've said all that I can say, and hope that you will do as I've bid. I hope that when you are born, we become great friends, and I am able to teach you a few things. But this particular matter is something that can only be taught in my death, for if I told you while I lived, you would have surely gone to your father, and I do not know how such an interaction would end. I love you, I'm sure I will, and again, for the sake of your life, and quite possibly the entire planet's, do as I've commanded. That's it. As the letter said, The cane's handle comes off, and I can see small, somewhat rusted metal pieces within. Inside the wooden box is the aforementioned vial, and it's filled with a strange, purplish liquid. It's crazy, what my grandfather wants me to do. But on the very same day of his death, my father started behaving strangely. And I don't mean what you'd expect of someone whose father has just died. No, my dad seemed unusually contemplative, and not in a mournful way, but as if he were considering some newfound knowledge, and its use to him. I don't think my mother noticed. She was close to my grandfather and was nearly as bereaved as you'd expect my father to be. The letter said I have a week, and it's only the first day after my grandfather's death. I need some time to think, and to observe my father more closely. My grandfather, though joyful and kind, wasn't a flippant man. He wouldn't make such an elaborate, morbid joke. I'm going to sleep, and we'll see what tomorrow holds. Day 2. Several weird things happened today. We had our grandfather's funeral, we reminisced on his life and the time we spent with him, and did the usual post-death things people do. But throughout the entire time, my father still seemed persistently preoccupied, as I mentioned earlier. Something vexed him, and his absent-mindedness during conversations became so noticeable that my mom even took him aside and asked what was wrong. I don't know what he told her, but apparently it was satisfying enough, and she let him be for the rest of the day. I've been staying with my parents for the last 2 days, and I initially planned on returning to my home tomorrow. But a few hours ago, while I washed dishes and my mother cleaned up elsewhere, my father started groaning, loudly, from his bedroom. We rushed in, and found him shirtless, keeled over, on his knees, clutching at his stomach. He was on the verge of tears, and his wailing heightened, became almost intolerable. My mother told me to call an ambulance, but my father quieted up at this, and insisted that I do no such thing. He was still in obvious pain, but his voice was firm, certain. I wasn't a child anymore, but I obeyed that tone. 15 minutes passed before my father felt well enough to stand and walk around. He speculated that something he'd eaten didn't sit well with him, and dismissed my mother's repeated requests to take him to the hospital. He said he'd take a few antacid tablets and relax, and again the tone in his voice intimated that he'd hear no arguments on the matter. At first, I was inclined to believe him. The food hadn't been exceptional, and I'd even felt a bit iffy after eating a casserole prepared by one of my grandfather's friends. But before I left, my father called to me, and motioned for my mother to leave the room. They exchanged a look that seemed suggestive of something, but I couldn't tell what. When my mother left, he had me sit beside him on his bed, and asked me, "So, what did your grandfather leave you? What was in the note, and the box?" When the lawyer initially dealt out the items, my father had respected my grandfather's wishes for privacy between himself and I, so his sudden interest immediately set off an alarm in my head, especially after the inexplicable fit of anguish he'd just endured. I hadn't yet made up my mind about whether or not I believed the contents of the letter, but my father's inquiry definitely aided in tilting my opinion towards their validity. Just talked about some memories we shared together. Some well-wishing, grandfatherly advice, things like that. I tried to sound as casual as possible, despite my father's narrowing eyes. He looked at me for a moment, his disbelief not at all hidden, and replied, "But the letter looked pretty old. The paper had yellowed, even. What could he have said about you and him?" I met my father's eyes, which had reddened from the pain, or perhaps from some other physiological event. I wanted to call him out, then. Ask why he cared so much, and if the things my grandfather had said were true. But I didn't. It was too early in the week my grandfather had allotted me, and if I was wrong, if my grandfather had been playing a sick joke, I would not only look like an idiot, but I'd surely hurt my father's feelings. So, I said, "Sorry Dad, just between him and I? I'm sure you can understand." And then I left, leaving him in the darkness of his room. On my way back to the kitchen I saw my mom in the living room, rummaging through some boxes in the storage closet. She wore a black dress, but had thrown on a white apron earlier when she had been baking, and it was stained with smears and dust. Several boxes bordered her. She was kneeling into the closet, and the boxes she had gone through were discarded behind her. They all looked old, and I only recognized 1 or 2 of the dozen or so she had pulled out. I sat there, watching her. She was hurrying, frantically searching for something, and the exigence of her searching made me uneasy. I called out to her, asked her what she was looking for. She turned around, and I recoiled. Her face was deep red, a large vein forked across her forehead, and her eyes were horribly wide. She stood, silently, and began nudging the boxes back into the closet with her feet, never taking her eyes off me as she did so. I didn't say anything, the scene was too bizarre, too unsettling, and so I stood there, fear-stricken. When she had cleared the clutter, she began walking towards me, advancing, her gait plainly hostile. Her face had lost some of its redness, but her sable hair was a mess, and her eyes were still half-crazed. My mother isn't a woman of intimidating stature, she's only 5'4", and fairly thin. But in that moment, she may as well have been a titan, coming to crush underfoot a pitiful human, me. I backed up against the wall, and she stood inches from me, glaring up at me with malice in her eyes. I started to speak, but my mouth had dried, and only managed to sputter a few unintelligible syllables. My mom's hand flashed out, seizing my throat, and with a strength I would have thought impossible for someone of her size, she brought me down to her face level. Through gritted teeth she snarled, "I am your father's wife. I love him, and will do anything for him, just as I would for you. But remember, I pledged my life to him. No matter what obstacle he faces, I will be with him. No matter what opponent he faces, I will stand beside him. You remember that while you stay in this house. Our house." She let go of me then, and walked off into the hall towards their bedroom. I heard a door slam, and muffled voices speaking. I exhaled audibly, unaware that I had been holding my breath. My mother had subtly, or not subtly, if you took note of her demeanor, threatened me. Did she know what my grandfather's letter detailed? I kept it in my room, same with the cane, in the old hiding place I used as a kid. My headboard has a portion of paneling which comes off, revealing a hollowed space, and it was there that I stashed the cane, vial inserted, and the letter. So, what was she looking for in the closet? After I recovered from the shock of the strange confrontation, I went over to the closet and inspected the boxes she had gone through. Most of them contained family memorabilia, and random items that didn't really have a place anywhere else but were too sentimental or potentially valuable to just throw away. I searched for about 5 minutes, not caring if I was discovered, compelled to find answers as to why my mother had demonstrated such open hostility towards me. I had almost given up when I found, in a small, seemingly unnoticed box, a stack of papers within a leather portfolio. They were plainly scientific formulae, and although I never got better than a B in any science class, I could tell that they were highly complex, the listed materials, required equipment, and instructions of handling being of a weird, almost alchemical nature. I'm afraid to list any of them here, for fear that someone may concoct something inimical to their health. The diagrams, mostly of human and humanoid figures, came across as mysteriously sinister. I returned the boxes I had drawn out to the closet, and they kept the papers. I finished washing the dishes, cleaned up the rest of the kitchen, and went to my room. A friend of mine is currently studying neuroscience. I texted her pictures of the papers, and asked if she has any ideas about what they mean. I had planned on leaving tomorrow, but something strange is going on with not just my father, but my mother as well, and my grandfather's murderous and pleading note has been given a significant level of credence after tonight's events. Or, maybe I'm just not fully considering the context of everything. My grandfather did just die, and he and my father were as close as a father and son could be, definitely closer than I am with my father. I'm not saying I had an unhappy childhood, or that my father distanced himself from me or was a bad man. But he and my grandfather shared something, some spark, or closeness, that my father and I didn't. Maybe I just don't understand, and my mom, knowing how my father feels, doesn't want me to upset him even more. What if my father is just hurt, saddened that his father left me something so private and personal, while my father got a collection of old watches? That would explain why he was so determined to find out what the note said. And I've heard that emotional pain can also manifest physically, which would explain my father's abdominal troubles. I'm going to sleep, and will update again tomorrow night. Day 3. My mother is dead, and my father is missing. I've suffered quite a bit myself, but I'll live. This will be my final entry. I plan on recovering, and eventually going to look for my father. I have about 30 minutes until my friend arrives, so I'll relate what happened today. The day started off normally. The three of us sat down for breakfast, my mother cooked, and conversation was light. We had coffee, scrambled eggs garnished with shredded cheddar cheese, sausage links, and plump slices of French toast. A deliciously unhealthy breakfast, one I hadn't had for a while. Since becoming an adult, I tried to stay healthy and fit, which was considerably easy, compared to the difficulties I've heard others face in their attempts. I asked my father how he felt, and he assured me that he was fine. My mother, though appropriately courteous, did not mention the events of last night, nor did her mannerisms suggest that they had even occurred. She smiled at me, offered additional helpings, and behaved as a normal, non-violent mother would. After breakfast, my father and I cleaned up the dishes, then went outside, sat on the porch while we finished off the remainder of the coffee. It was a gray morning, overcast with interminable clouds, through which the sun emitted feeble rays. A soft mist had settled, presumably from last night's rain, and everything had an aspect of wetness to it. It was tolerably cold, and I thanked my earlier self for remembering to pack my cardigan. My father wore a faded black t-shirt that had seen more years than I'd been alive, and his usual pajama pants. He stared at the sky, as if looking past the impenetrable cloudage to gaze upon something else. I silently sipped my coffee, waiting for the conversation I knew would come. After a few minutes, his eyes drifted back towards terrestrial sights, and he pointed at the sidewalk across the street. "Do you remember when you were a kid, just 5 or 6, and your bike hit the raised part of the sidewalk? You flipped forward, fell right on your face. Your mother saw and came out screaming, and even though you had started laughing like a little idiot, she got all worked up and called the city, had them come out that same day and fix the sidewalk. She would have sued, I'm sure, if you hadn't gone on about how cool it was." I remembered. At some point over the years, one end of the cement slab had come loose and peeked over the edge, and I had the misfortune of going over it when it was just high enough to stop a small bike tire. I got launched about 4 feet forward and fell right on my face. Then, it seemed like I flew a lot farther, and although it hurt like hell, the exhilaration of it had produced laughs, rather than tears. I didn't break a nose or retain any scars, blessed with that chance invulnerability that kids seem to have during such situations. Yeah, I remember. It was a random memory, but a nice one. Dad had bought me ice cream, and my mother a brownie. She's not a fan of cold foods, right after they made sure I was all right. He nodded, a slight smile on his face, and finished his coffee. He turned to me, his face relaxed, calm, a total contrast to the pain it had worn the night before. "Son, I love you. Your mother loves you. Your grandfather loved you. But life isn't always fair, as I'm sure you've come to know in adulthood, and sometimes we have to make choices. Choices that would hurt the ones we love. I just want you to know that it's okay to make those choices, it's a part of life, and everyone has to make them at some point." I sat there in my chair, unsure what to say. He smiled, nodded again, and got up. He knocked my head with the joint of his middle finger, as you would a door, and as he had when I was a child, then walked back into the house. I sat there for a while, looking at nothing in particular, letting the wind and mist of the gray day blur and obscure my vision. Something about it all felt a bit ominous. Later, around noon, my father had left to meet with the lawyers concerning some things about my grandfather's estate. My mother was in the basement, running on her treadmill. I figured it was a good time to talk to my friend, who I had texted yesterday and asked if she had any ideas about the documents I'd shared with her. I checked my phone, which I'd left charging in my room all morning, and found a single reply, which said "call me." The text was designated as urgent. I called her, and we spoke for about 30 minutes. A lot of things were said, some of which I can't repeat here, and all of it extremely strange. She told me that the papers discussed, detailed, and gave instructions for bizarre and patently impossible medical procedures, which involved, among many other things, removal of organs from unsedated patients, exchanging of humors, rapid cellular regeneration with disregard for the Hayflick limit, the reversal or even avoidance of senescence, brain transplantation, reconciliation of the mind-body problem, and several other similarly dubious things. She said she would have disregarded it all as pseudo-scientific speculation, if it wasn't for the obvious intelligence of the author or authors, and the sophistication of the proposed experimentation. She said it was all leagues beyond her ken, the terminology and methods used were of honestly genius acumen. There was worry in her voice, too, because my father's name was mentioned several times throughout the paper, usually as a subject of study. She found it equally worrying that above diagrams, which depicted beings of near-human anatomy, was my father's name. I almost told her then, about my grandfather's note, what it demanded of me. But something told me to keep it to myself, to settle things in the family, so I quickly thanked her for her help and ended the call. I texted her right after, asking if she'd come by to pick me up at 6 p.m., an hour after my father said he should be home from the meeting with the lawyers. I was shaken, but also relieved in a way. My grandfather's note was truthful. But that relief was quickly usurped by dread, because it meant I had no other choice but to carry out the deed. I sat there on my bed for a while, having the argument of a lifetime with myself. Part of me asking, so what? He's still your father. Let him develop into what he has a natural right to be. Maybe you should align yourself with his actions and nature, more than humanity's, anyway. While the opposing side argued, "You're human, enough for your grandfather, at least. It is your responsibility to neutralize this threat to your species. You've inherited a duty, do it." Hours passed, I pondered my options, all the while avoiding my mother, who I didn't trust to keep the good mood she had at breakfast. Eventually I heard a car pull into the driveway, and my father walk into the house. I knew he'd shower soon, so I waited in my room for him to go in. Once I heard his door close, and, after pressing my ears to the adjoining wall, heard the shower running, I gathered the cane loaded with the poison and left my room. My mother stood in the hallway, guarding their door. She wore a light blue sweater and sweatpants a shade darker, with her black hair kept in a ponytail. She just finished her exercising, by the way she perspired. The way she stood was plainly defensive, ready, and her face no longer bore the cheerfulness it had earlier in the day. She noticed the cane in my hand, and frowned disapprovingly. "He's your father, Albert." I was oddly relaxed. I knew I'd have to face her at some point, and the cane imparted a strength to me, a determination I wouldn't have otherwise had if I had to make do with some random object. "I know," I replied, somberly. She marched towards me, and I remembered what my grandfather had said in the letter. "The cane works fine as a blunt weapon." I swung it, and my mother crumpled to the ground. She hadn't flinched, or even tried to dodge the blow, which made the violence even worse to me. For all that she'd threatened the night before, she didn't put up any real fight. Like she knew it was inevitable. I apologized, swore, "I'm not sure in what order," and stepped over her. I arrived at their bedroom door and entered, and was relieved to hear the shower still going. I studied the cane and found the button which, after being depressed, would fire the poison dart. I had just beat down my mother, I didn't want to go a step further and impale my father. I was fine with the cowardice of shooting. I went to the master bathroom's door, turned the handle, and quietly opened it. Cane poised to fire, I crept towards the shower, the seashell-decorated curtain drawn, and prepared to kill my dad. Only when I pulled aside the curtain, he wasn't in the shower. It was empty. "I see you've made your choice." I spun around, and standing there fully clothed was my father, dressed in the same suit and pants he had worn to the meeting. He gave a weak smile, which suggested the hurt of betrayal, and its subsequent forgiveness. "Dad?" He held up a hand, telling me to stop. He then motioned for me to come out of the bathroom. I complied. He sat down on the bed and patted a spot beside him, and I sat there, still holding the cane. He exhaled, then, without looking at me, asked, "What do you think I am?" Startled, I took a moment to consider the question before responding. "Grandpa said you're an alien. At least, part alien." My father wasn't noticeably fazed by the statement, and nodded in confirmation. "Yes, that's what I am, essentially. And what are you?" Again, the question took me off guard, because I hadn't truly considered the implications of my lineage. I never felt alien, or behaved in any inhuman way, as far as I knew. And my grandfather didn't seem troubled by my status as my father's son, so I assumed I wouldn't inherit the cruel alien nature. I made sure my response was measured, not showing my fear at what his question suggested. "I'm your son. And as far as I know, I'm human." My father turned to me, eyes glittering with newly formed tears, his smile a bit broader. "Yes, you're human. Completely so, if it helps. And, if my word is enough, you're my son. Others may call you something else, but you've always been, and you'll always be, my son." Thrice now, his response took me by surprise, and I felt a strange, indescribable emotion swell within my chest. "What are you saying?" It was his turn at being surprised. "Oh, you don't know? Your mother thought you'd found the papers." I recalled the conversation I'd had with my friend about them, and the strange, unfeasible practices and postulations detailed therein. "I did, but I don't see what they have to do with me. Your name was mentioned several times, though." His smile faded then, and sadness overtook him completely. A few tears fell, unchallenged. "Ah, so you don't understand. Well son, I'm sorry to drop this on you now, in this way, but there's something you must know." He stood and walked towards his closet, and I made to follow, but he motioned that I should remain seated. A portion of the closet wall had a false back, and from the hollow space he retrieved a box. "You're not the only one with a hiding place." He knew, the entire time. His smile returned, then, at my apparently shocked expression. Yes, I knew you put the cane and the letter in there. I didn't read it, upheld your grandfather's wish, but I'm aware of what it says, generally. Sure, I could have taken the cane and destroyed it, but I wanted you to make a choice. You're an adult, after all. And a choice you have made. He returned to the bed, sat down, and placed the box between us. He told me to open it. I set the cane on my lap, unguarded, and removed the lid from the box. Inside were several Polaroid pictures, with dates listed in the white spaces beneath the images. The images were of hideous, malformed things, some disturbingly embryonic, others born and nascently matured though still plainly disfigured and disgusting. The dates ascribed to each picture were oddly close to each other, some mere days apart. Oh God, what are these? My father took a few pictures from the stack, there were at least a dozen photographs, and studied them unemotionally. They were children. Our children. Your mother and I had them, and they all turned out so. He waved his hand at the lot, indicating their shared grotesqueness. I was beyond confused, hurt in a way I didn't yet understand, and admittedly terrified. What do you mean your children? My father's eyes searched mine, and after finding what they sought, he replied, you know what I mean. Say it. And I did. They're the results of interspecies breeding. Failed specimens. Abortions, miscarriages. Monsters. He interjected. Then how? How did you come to be? He removed an envelope from the bottom of the box, then gathered the pictures and returned them. He passed me the envelope and nodded. I opened it, revealing another picture, this one newer. It was of my family. My father held a baby, and he was smiling from ear to ear. I assumed my mother had taken the picture. I turned the picture over and found writing on the back. Albert. August 12, 1995. First successful introduction of alien elements with the human genome. Zero inimical side effects. Human child granted enhanced physiological operation by alien integration. Projected lifespan to be mid-100s. Increased resistance to virtually all diseases. Predilections to be observed and recorded as it grows. All signs point to normal human thought, emotions, and behaviors. Alien integration undetectable by present human sciences. I returned the picture to the box. My father put his hand on my shoulder, and waited for me to gather my thoughts. So, you're saying that I was created? Yes. You weren't conceived the natural way. The gestation period of the alien species is rather rapid, a few weeks compared to our 9 months. But still, it was wreaking havoc on your mother's mere human body, and we couldn't bear to bring another one of them into the world. So, we started from the ground up, used the genetic material of those failed children and built you. We tipped the scales heavily towards humanity, and let the alien DNA act as a sort of booster. You're healthier, more resilient, and stronger than any human can naturally be. Stronger. That's when I realized why Mom had gone down so quickly, so easily. It wasn't that she didn't try block the attack, she hadn't even seen it coming. Mom. My dad's grip on my shoulder tensed. It's okay, you didn't know. I'll take care of her. I'm sorry to dump all of this on you now, but it's time to make your choice, knowing what you know. He picked up the cane and placed it into my hands. I looked at it, it was so old, and yet it could end the life of someone who would soon become incredibly powerful, who might bring on the end of the world. But that someone had made me. Created me despite all other attempts at producing offspring failing. Sure, I was forged, in a way, but still built the same constituent material as the others. He did his best to make me human, so I wouldn't become some monster. I won't do it. The words left me before I thought I'd made up my mind. My dad stared at me for a while, his face showing nothing of his thoughts. He then gathered the box and placed it atop the cane, and his lips curved into a slight smile. Burn the pictures. Burn the letter, and the research documents. But keep the cane. If you ever change your mind, come find me. I love you, son, and I love your mother. But who knows how I'll feel about the rest of humanity in the coming days. Who knows what I'll do. Your grandfather was a good, honorable man. He had no idea what you are, or of the other children. Nevertheless, he entrusted you with a responsibility. Be ready to fulfill it, if circumstances change. And with that, my father left. He took my mother, where, I have no idea. I sat on the bed for a long time, going over the conversation in my head. My friend arrived at 6 just as I had requested. She asked what happened, and where my parents were, but I only told her that I was ready to go home. And so we drove, away from the house, away from my father. I definitely say I've suffered, The shock of a grim truth. But I'll recover, and one day I'll find my father. But for now, I'll just live my life, enjoy my humanity.